Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are taking a full architectural tour of the state's financial house. If government finances usually make your eyes glaze over, stick with me, because we're going to fix that right now. By using a master blueprint and visualizing the whole economy as a giant isometric building assembly, it's going to completely change how you see economics. Let's get building.
Here is the structural blueprint we'll be following today. We'll look at the overarching budget blueprint, then explore Chamber 1 for revenue, walk over to Chamber 2 for capital, figure out how to balance the blueprint, and finally check for structural stress, also known as budget deficits.
Starting off with Part 1, the Government Budget Blueprint.
At its very core, the government budget is just our overarching architectural plan. Think of it as a master document that plots out all estimated receipts, basically the expected income, and the proposed expenditures for the upcoming fiscal year, which always runs from April 1st to March 31st. It tells us exactly how much material we expect to bring in and exactly where we plan to build with it.
Moving right along to Part 2, Chamber 1, Revenue.
Let's walk over to the east wing of our blueprint to check out Chamber 1. Now, the golden rule of this specific chamber is incredibly strict. Absolutely nothing happening in here will build a new physical asset or alter a financial liability. This chamber is purely about current, non-redeemable consumption and basic, everyday maintenance. It is strictly the housekeeping wing of our government structure. So you might be wondering, how do we keep the lights on in this housekeeping wing? Well, the government relies heavily on non-redeemable taxes, and I mean heavily. Tax revenues, things like your personal income tax, corporate tax, and GST, they make up a staggering 89% of the central government's total public receipts. That is huge. It's absolutely the primary lifeblood of our housekeeping budget.
But, this chamber isn't entirely just taxes. The government kind of acts like a business here, too. It gathers funds from interest on previous loans, or it collects dividends from public enterprises, like Bell or LIC. It also brings in money from administrative fees, commercial service fees, yes, even from DoorDarshan, and receives various external grants and aid.
Okay, so the crucial question is, where does all this housekeeping cash actually go? We spend it on recurrent, day-to-day revenue expenditures. This means paying the salaries required to maintain law and order, funding the daily operations of national defense, providing social subsidies, and very importantly, paying interest on old debts. But remember our golden rule here. None of this spending actually creates any new physical assets, like a bridge or a shiny new factory. It simply maintains the house exactly as it currently stands.
Which brings us to Part 3, Chamber 2, the Capital Budget.
Let's step across the hall into the heavy-duty structural engineering wing, the ultimate asset shifter. Unlike the living room we just left, the foundational rule here is the exact opposite. Every single transaction actively shifts the government's assets or liabilities. If it doesn't change the actual structural integrity of our financial house, it simply doesn't belong in Chamber 2.
Here is how the heavy lifting actually happens. Capital receipts raise funds by taking on structural liabilities, like snagging market loans from the RBI, or by reducing assets, such as selling off shares of public enterprises. On the flip side of that, capital expenditures invest those funds into building lasting physical assets. This is where we're actually buying land, constructing buildings, or purchasing major machinery.
And looking at our blueprint side by side really illustrates this contrast beautifully. Revenue spending is a recurrent year-after-year maintenance cost with zero asset creation. Think stuff like salaries and pensions. Capital spending, on the other hand, is a non-recurrent structural investment that physically builds the state's foundation. Again, think land, machinery, and big infrastructure projects.
All right, let's look at Part 4, Balancing the Blueprint.
With both chambers now fully constructed in our minds, we really need to step back and look at the whole building. Depending on our total receipts versus our total expenditures, our financial house is going to sit in one of three states. It'll either be a surplus, where we collect more than we spend, balanced, where they are perfectly equally matched, or a deficit, where our spending is completely outpacing what we collect.
And this structural balance dictates the real-world economy that you and I live in. A surplus budget acts kind of like a cooling system. Taking money out of the economy reduces aggregate demand and helps fight off inflation. Conversely, a deficit budget acts as a stimulus heater. Pumping more money into the economy increases demand, which helps to thaw out a recession and create new jobs.
But this naturally brings us to a really critical architectural question, one that every single government has to face when reviewing its ledgers. What exactly happens when the structural cost of maintaining our financial house consistently exceeds what it actually earns?
That takes us to Part 5, Structural Stress, better known as budget deficits.
Let's examine the cracks in the foundation, starting right off with the revenue deficit. This happens when revenue expenditure exceeds revenue receipts. Put simply, the government is essentially taking out a mortgage just to buy daily groceries. It's dissaving, meaning it's relying on borrowed funds just to cover routine housekeeping. And doing this, it's inherently inflationary.
Next, we hit the fiscal deficit. This is the ultimate indicator of our total structural imbalance. It calculates the excess of total expenditure over all receipts, but crucially, it excludes borrowings. Why does it do that? Because it reveals the massive total scale of loans required from the public, the RBI, and foreign markets just to keep the entire building from tipping over.
Finally, peeling back the last layers of our blueprint, we find the primary deficit. This is calculated by taking that massive fiscal deficit and subtracting the interest payments the government is already making on its past borrowings. This metric is fascinating. It reveals the government's current fiscal discipline by removing the heavy structural load inherited from the past. Basically, it shows exactly how much the government is borrowing today simply to meet its current non-interest expenses.
If we fail to manage these structural deficits, especially the fiscal deficit, our financial house seriously risks collapsing. The government borrows to meet the deficit, which increases future liabilities through interest payments, which in turn leads to more borrowing just to repay the old loans. As our source material chillingly notes, this creates an undue burden on future generations and triggers what is known as a debt trap. So I'm going to leave you with this final thought. As we design our economic blueprints today, are we building a stable home for tomorrow, or are we just passing a massive mortgage onto the next generation? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this structural breakdown gives you a much clearer view of the state's financial house.